the next speaker, Susan McDonald, I really welcome to the stage. So I think Madeleine's introduction actually says it all. Susan, it's been great to have you as a continuing sort of voice on the Northern Australian space and to continue to sort of drive this really strong sense of bipartisanship, not just bilateralism in the conversation. So welcome to the stage.
Good afternoon, and it's already been so exciting, hasn't it, to hear the sort of presentations that we've had and to have this these consistent themes coming forward. So I want to acknowledge the Territorian Members of Parliament, the Leader, the Honourable Natasha Files, the Honourable Nicole Mannison. Thank you for your welcomes and having us here. I particularly want to acknowledge Madeleine King, who has become a friend as well as a colleague, and Luke Gosling, because it is absolutely right what Luke said. We have got to hunt as a pack from Northern Australia. There are 14 federal members of Parliament and senators who live in Northern Australia out of 327. So that's 4.3% of the representation, 5.5% of the population we heard earlier from the RDAs. So we already have a smaller voice. That's a problem. I also want to acknowledge Glenn Butcher and Stephen Dawson. Great to have you here as part of the conversations today. Most importantly, Professor Alan Dale, Chief Scientist for the Cooperative Research Centre for Developing Northern Australia, energetic organiser. I'm sure we've all been given a bit of a razz about what we say today. I also want to acknowledge the board and employees of the Northern Australia RDAs, of the NAIF, of the NACRC, the Indigenous References Group. Colin Saltmere, I can't see you, but I bought a little bit of camel wheel Spinifex from our country to be here this afternoon. And every organisation working hard to develop Northern Australia, because you all are that strong voice that Alan talked about this morning when he referred to we need a strong voice. Now, Northern Australia has always been a region of vision. It is alluring, it's full of promise, and it is from the challenges, rising to the challenges that we meet in the north, that we can make the most of it. Now, I've identified 5 key elements that forms a framework for me, how I think about how we achieve success for Northern Australia. It's building transformational infrastructure, ports, rail, roads, dams, housing. This is not an exhaustive list, to mitigate risk and enable greater investment. Coordination across all the levels of government. Taxation incentives to boost population and kickstart business development. Utilising regional data like what Jonathan Pavetto from AEC referred to, CPI, road safety data, immigration, public investment, regional GDP, so the government investment can be better prioritised and effort better prioritised. Streamlining of approvals for resources, including critical minerals, rare earths, gas, minerals, fertilisers and agriculture, and reducing red tape for small businesses, and particularly so that we can see more Indigenous businesses and jobs in Northern Australia. So the first one, transformational infrastructure. It is imperative that we deeply understand the policy and legislative settings that should facilitate but often restricts Northern Australian success. And the one example I'm going to give you today is the National Water Initiative. It focuses on improving water efficiency, on sustainability and on allocations. It was driven out of the cross-partite arrangements for the Murray-Darling. But it has not considered the development of water in Northern Australia. The requirement for pre-sold water allocations places a preemptive cost recovery requirement on water projects. Irrigated agriculture is critical at a time when the recent World Peace Forum found food security and food nutrition to be a looming global crisis. And water storage and management is a key tool in managing climate variability, something that we know all too well in the north. But under this pre-sold water allocations logic, projects like Tinaroo Dam on the Tablelands in North Queensland, which produces $500 million worth of agricultural produce, would not be built now. That's something I'm doing some work on. A coordinated government response. We need bipartisan support to take advantage of the momentum developed by the former government and coordinated local, state and territory and federal planning. We've recently seen the Federal Infrastructure Department put on hold road projects in Northern Australia. Dirt roads are not being sealed. Roads are not being upgraded. Water storage is not being built. And I'm sorry, a pet project, but CASA, the Civil Aviation Safety Authority, continues their unchecked advancement that left 3 Torres Strait islands with no commercial service, forcing people into open dinghies on the open sea. And I'm sure you all read with horror the loss of another life in such circumstances because Canberra-based bureaucrats could not secure safe travel. Driving on a Northern Australian road means you're 5 times more likely to be killed or suffer serious and life-altering injury. Now, I'm not suggesting that that is all the responsibility of roads, but it is another key element. Taxation. So transport and logistics. It is currently taking between 16 and 20 years for a new copper mine to move from discovery, and as usual I'll do a shout out to any geologists in the room, particularly those who are in an era where the showers were cold and the beer was hot. Thank you for your work. But from discovery through to approvals and production. Now, given that we know that minerals like copper, vanadium, amongst others, are urgently needed as the world turns to greater electrification, indeed in less than 30 years, global copper demand will have doubled. But one example of an incentive to facilitate the feasibility of such projects in Northern Australia is a proposed tariff holiday for rail freight and double stacking of containers on trains to allow for new mining projects for small players to reach financial viability and get into production. More royalties, more company taxes, more jobs. Everything I think about is with the lens of connecting the West and the East, rather than the more jurisdictionally aligned North to South. So just imagine with me for a moment building the Townsville Port Rail connection while further extending the rail line from Queensland into the Northern Territory to connect with the North-South rail line, as well as connecting power and gas infrastructure across the border. Not to mention air travel. Wade Chiesa, point well made, and I think everybody else here who's talked about the indirect flights they've taken. And in my maiden speech to the Senate, I said that zonal taxation rates and rebates must be considered in any plan to grow the regions, but given that Alan wants us to stay on time, I'll put a line through the rest of that. But regional data, utilising regional data like CPI, road safety, regional GDP, immigration, public investment, we cannot accurately assess economic health and needs in Northern Australia without it. And I want to acknowledge the work of the 3 Northern Australian universities, Charles Darwin, CQU and JCU, and their leadership and the Vice-Chancellors to establish the Northern Australia Universities Alliance. This is a real opportunity to harness our brightest minds to document and house data to further our agenda with facts, not just the vision in a North Australia Economic Institute. Because I see one of my critical roles as being one of those strong voices talking to banks, investment houses, super funds, commercial and agricultural agents, and making them aware of northern opportunity. But I'm always reminded of the challenge when the conversation quickly turns to Northern Australia risk. Cyclones, crocodiles, the lack of infrastructure, the lack of workforce, but mostly the lack of knowledge about investment-ready projects. Approximately, I've talked about the support for critical minerals and minerals fertilisers. Somebody's left their phone here. Oh, looking for a call from Ellie? Yeah, right. I get another minute for that. Approximately half the food we eat today has been produced thanks to mineral fertiliser. Australia imports most of its potash needs when we have huge reserves in Western Australia. The Georgina Basin, straddling northwest Queensland and the Northern Territory, contains as much of 90% of Australia's known phosphate deposits. So I recently wrote to Minister King asking for potash and phosphate, aluminium, alumina, bauxite, nickel, copper and zinc to be added to the critical minerals strategy, because Australia has significant production capacity for aluminium, nickel, copper and zinc, and is the world's largest producer of bauxite. It's the second largest producer and exporter of alumina, has the largest economic reserves of zinc and the second largest reserves of copper and nickel. And while the Western Australian reserves of lithium are exciting, remember that 30% of the world's reserves of vanadium are right here in Australia, in Northern Australia. And while lithium batteries will power electric vehicles, it is vanadium redox batteries that will stabilise electricity networks, and we can make them right here in Northern Australia. And it does make no sense. We have to remain outcomes focused. It makes no sense to me that mining, agricultural, tourism projects are held to rigorous approvals, processes and standards, but renewable projects are able to wholesale clear vegetation, flatten tops of hills and mobilise sediment with different standards. We have to fix that. It is not maintaining community expectations, because we are the leaders in renewable energy and sustainable agriculture and forestry, Indigenous involvement, public education collaboration and innovation and research, and the work of the CRC for Northern Australia has proven that. But right here in Darwin, the recent federal budget cuts have seen the end of funding to the very successful Darwin Innovation Hub. It's an example of government has the ability to prioritise or not the development of our unique capability in Northern Australia. So, in wrapping up, Alan, time for talk about Northern Australia has long passed. We have the innovators, the speculators, the investors, the scientists and the heavy lifting. What we need more of is action. And the AEC analysis this morning showing the reduced public investment is shocking to me. I'm asking southern-based decision makers to show some faith in the north. We've achieved more here than our forefathers ever dreamed possible, and we want to do more. But without an adequate population to wield heavy political influence, with only 14 of us focused on the north, we need our leaders to back us, to recognise our passion and our drive, and to reward the support that we need. And, again, as Alan's already said, we need to be a strong voice, not just here, but in the south, talking to those who don't know our story. We're simply asking for a level playing field. We're asking for acknowledgement of the hard work done, the hard work ongoing and the hard work to come. It should be seen as an investment, not a cost. This region is big, it is wild, it is sparsely populated, but we produce what matters to Australia and the world. When we look at what we've already achieved against the odds, Alan, I'm sure you'll agree, it is clear that more practical support from government and our future remains bright, because it is the development of Northern Australia that benefits all Australia. In the royalties and the taxes generated, in the creation of meaningful and purposeful work for all of our northern communities, and the improvement of services to each and every Northern Australian. Thank you.